I think it is clear to believe in the power of ideas.
Fresh thinking at the Manhattan Institute.
My name is Rod Nichols. Good afternoon. Welcome to the Manhattan Institute Luncheon. I'm proud to be a member of the Manhattan Institute Board, and if you're here for the first time, as I just found out from a few people, I hope you'll learn more about this extraordinary organization. President Larry Mohn is here, and several of his able staff are here. So find out about this outfit that is open, empirical, evidence-based, and welcomes debate. Today we welcome Peter Huber, a formidable debater in many fields, always sharp, who takes analysis seriously, which some don't, and treats the nation's future seriously, which some don't. Unlike many pundits at other think tanks, Peter is numerate. That is, he knows numbers. I remember as a young physicist learning what great physicist Lord Kelvin had as an injunction. Kelvin said, when you cannot measure it, when you cannot express it in numbers, you have scarcely in your thoughts advanced to the stage of science. And he added, whatever the matter may be. Well, I don't think you can impose that on the arts, probably not on parenting, certainly not on romance. But it's a very wise injunction, do your numbers, if you're doing public policy. And I must add, it's an antidote also to what I might say is a popular idea, the audacity of hope. Hope tends to shrink a bit when you give it numerical analysis. Smart people actually like numbers. Peter's earlier book, you may have noticed in your introduction to this meeting, elicited a very nice compliment from Bill Gates, who knows his numbers. Bill Gates said that The Bottomless Well was the only book I've seen that really explains energy, and I assume that Mr. Gates had numbers in mind. Similarly, Walter Wriston, the late Walter Wriston, who was one of the co-founders of the Manhattan Institute, when he looked at the book, which came out, I think, 4 years ago, he said, this is a book for anyone who deplores groupthink and demands original analysis. Kathy Wriston is here today, and I'm glad she will be listening to Peter talk about what her late husband enjoyed. Peter is going to be talking about energy, and when it comes to energy, the data and the numbers are really practically the whole story. Peter, I think, is going to say a little about China and India, but I just wanted to point out in the introduction, last year, 2008, China accounted for 3/4 of global energy growth. That's according to the best statistical review that I could find. That's going to continue. Last year, 2008, U.S. energy consumption dropped almost 3%, partly for efficiency reasons, partly because of the recession. But we need energy to grow economically, and so do China and India. I've worked in both those countries, and much of their energy will come from coal. So it's no surprise that China and India resist international regimes that limit what they do and how they do it. Realism here means it's a matter of numbers, people, jobs, food, energy. Realism is central. Another great physicist, Richard Feynman, said, for a successful technology, reality must take precedence over public relations. For nature cannot be fooled. Well, that takes quantitative analysis. I first met Peter in a study of telecommunications in New York State a good many years ago. Then we collaborated on an effort to squash junk science in the courtroom. He's a truly gifted man, PhD in mechanical engineering from MIT, went to Harvard Law School, clerked for Justice Ruth Ginsburg, and then later Justice Sandra Day O'Connor. He's an author of diverse books, articles, essays. Please join me in welcoming Peter Huber.
Actually, when I clerked for Ruth, that was a while ago, and we're so intimate I still call her judge. She was on the D.C. Circuit back then, but O'Connor was on the Supreme Court. So look at it this way: healthcare, the 15% of GDP we consume lying down is really our lethargy budget. Energy, the rushing about stuff, is bigger, and in many ways more insidious. The money up for grabs, the pot up for grabs here is probably 20 to 25% of our budget, some fraction of that on fuel, and then more even on the huge amounts of hardware, the engines and the furnaces and the boilers and so on that are very tightly tied to the fuels themselves. The grab for the energy economy is also much more stealthy. Most of Washington's spending here is and will be entirely off budget. It takes the form of regulatory mandates, and these mandates tend to start very high up in places like Copenhagen and then dive right down into an alphabet soup of agencies, EPA and DOE and FERC, without ever really passing through Congress or anywhere else. They're extraordinarily opaque and difficult. Very few people have any clue what they really add up to or what they cost. And I think it's fair to say that Washington and most other governments are counting on that. In the speeches, the president carefully frames the issue as first and foremost a fight against oil. And that keeps it simple, and it's good politics. I mean, what's there not to hate about oil? You know, you can take cost, terrorists, autocrats, carbon, to take your pick. He mentions climate too, but he always puts that after oil, which means, well, it means two things. At first, he's being less than candid because his administration clearly views oil as just one target among many. Its policy is attack carbon and maybe kill oil along the way if you can. And it also means that he's dodging the inconvenient economic truth. Because by far the cheapest substitute for this, which I am assured is crude oil, although it looks a little bit too fluid for that, but the people who sold me to me said it was. The main substitute for this, okay, which is a lot of carbon, is this, which is carbon in some other form. I mean, that's actually where the economics lie here, okay? And any policy, okay, by far the cheapest substitute for oil is carbon that you find in something else. And any policy that ignores that economic fact won't just fail, it will almost certainly backfire. It will be ignored by at least 80% of the world. It will be quietly celebrated by the oil nasties, the 10% of the world that controls 80% of the cheap and easily accessible oil. And to top it all, it will almost certainly help humanity burn more carbon, not less. There is an alternative, much less wildly ambitious, and that's to focus on cutting oil down to size and curb carbon along the way, if you can. That is a policy certainly that 90% of the world, including the vast majority of Americans of every political stripe, would love to embrace, because oil is by far the most expensive form of carbon out there, and putting aside the alternatives that don't actually do anything, oil is the most expensive, serious fuel around. So, you know, a kill oil strategy, if you can implement it, means above all that you'll end up burning less money, and that's very popular. And let's give it a name, this strategy. Let us call it the Steve Breyer energy policy. Yes, that's Steve Breyer. There's a moment in I think it's in Duck Soup, when one of the Marx brothers is trying to, I forget what, sell the Brooklyn Bridge or something like that, and the target of the pitch is somewhat skeptical, and the Marx brother says, well, who are you going to believe, me or your own lying eyes? And since we're in New York here, not Washington, let's go with the eyes. We're routinely told these days that greener is also cheaper, or will be real soon now. But here and abroad, the market very clearly and time and again has shown us that that's just not so. Greener may be a very good thing, but it's not cheaper. And we know this as a market fact, even if spreadsheets will tell us otherwise. In 1973, a couple of months after our current president celebrated his 12th birthday, the Arabs embargoed oil shipments to the countries that had backed the wrong side in the Yom Kippur War. In response, some of us are old enough to remember this, in response, Washington capped oil prices, rationed gasoline, imposed the first ever fuel economy mandates on cars, exempted ethanol from federal taxes, federal fuel taxes, launched a $20 billion program to transform coal into liquid fuel, and funded a slew of green alternatives. We were going to burn wood and garbage and peanut shells and chicken droppings and bacterial mats and human sewage. A Nobel Prize winner persuaded Congress to subsidize plantations of guayuli. Oil from that fine plant was going to make a real dent in crude. Sunlight was going to extract hydrogen from water to power electric power plants in our cars. With big tax subsidies, we went ahead and built really substantial wind farms in California and Hawaii and elsewhere. And Britain, sometimes attempting to be even greener than us, eventually launched the world's first commercial wave power station 50 miles off the coast of Scotland. It sank in a storm less than a month after it was launched. All of Washington's schemes for developing completely new fuels sank too. Oil's share of our U.S. energy economy peaked just shy of 50% of our total energy consumption in 1977. Gee whiz, renewables weren't visible on the global energy pie chart in 1973 and still aren't visible today. Carbon, either fresh, i.e. plants, or fossilized, supplied 97% of the world's energy in 1973. It supplies about 90% today, and almost all of that drop from 97% to 90% came from one fuel, uranium, nuclear power. Fortunately, some smart economists, some smart young economists also got involved in energy policy in the early 70s, and Steve Breyer was one of them. I'll get back to the details of what he and others advocated, but first, it's worth remembering, I wonder how many people know this, what their advocacy actually achieved. Electric power plants dropped from 17% oil back then to 1% today. Our homes were 25% oil back then. They are 5% today. The commercial sector of our energy economy was 28% oil back then. It is 3% today. Oil was squeezed out by two things: by cheap electricity generated with coal and natural gas and uranium, and it was squeezed out by natural gas directly, by people firing up new furnaces and boilers and so on with gas rather than oil. It took time. The ideas that these young energy economists were floating in the 70s became law at a glacial pace in the 80s and became economic reality only well into the 90s, just as the Asian economic crisis was pushing oil prices down to the historic lows. Anybody remember that? 1998, cheapest oil in history. But oil's share of our overall economy, this deregulation, economic deregulation, picked up momentum, and between 1973 and today, we knocked 10 points off oil's share of our energy economy, from just shy of 50% to slightly under 40%. And for a market this huge, with the fuel so tightly tied to long-term capital investment, 10 points off is a real achievement. Nobody else has delivered anything like that. The shift away from oil was driven by money. Coal, gas, and uranium, and the hardware that burns them, is cheaper than oil and the hardware that burns oil. Natural gas, the most expensive of the three, has consistently been priced, this is all in energy equivalent terms, has been consistently priced over the last 30 years somewhere between half as much and one-third as much as gasoline and diesel, which are the appropriate comparisons for fuels of comparable quality. As the deregulation of natural gas gained momentum, we began unlocking gigantic new fields. I mean, truly enormous new fields in Louisiana, Texas, Arkansas, and Pennsylvania. U.S. fields now provide more than twice as much energy in the form of gas than they do as oil. U.S. producers, of course, are now, what used to be called tight gas isn't tight anymore. They get it out of shale. That's where these new fields are producing from. Our domestic shale almost certainly contains enough gas to displace all of our oil consumption for the next 50 years at least, and I suspect it's a lot more than that. But our wheels rely almost entirely on oil, and oil in the United States now relies very substantially on them. Transportation accounts for 70% of our demand for oil, and 80% if you put aside petrochemicals, which are a rather different market. The standard explanation for these pie charts squeezing out oil out of other sectors of our economy but not laying a glove on our wheels is simply this, that liquid fuels pack an enormous amount of energy in a very small amount of weight and volume, and in transportation that's all important, that's decisive. So that, it is said, is why we didn't switch. Now, there is some real truth to that. Weight is indeed a serious obstacle for electric cars. It takes a lot of pounds of battery to deliver any kind of range on electricity, and there's no way anytime soon we're going to be powering 40-ton trucks on battery packs. But natural gas is very much better than that. It can quite readily provide about half the range of gasoline or diesel in a tank of the same size and weight. And 150 miles range is not as good as 300, but it's not so bad either. I mean, that is not enough of a difference, say, to maintain a $2 price swing between natural gas and diesel or gasoline fuel. So the question arises, why couldn't a guy as smart as Steve Breyer sort of finish the job here before retiring to do much less important work on the bench? Unlike oil and gas, gas basically, well, here's why he couldn't finish the job. Unlike oil, gas basically has to move through pipes. It's too thin and slippery to move other ways very easily. Those pipes inevitably run across public land, so gas moves from the well to where we use it only when and where the government says go. And governments are not good at saying go. For most of the 20th century, our very own pipe police orchestrated scarcities and gluts and boom and bust price instabilities as ruinous in our domestic gas market as any ever orchestrated by OPEC for oil. Supply and demand were both throttled by the politics of deploying new pipes, and the pipe police, astonishingly in retrospect, used their authority to control the entire gas market from end to end. For 40 years, all the key decades in the rise of the automobile and our surface transportation infrastructure, they chose to regulate not just the pipe and the cost of transporting gas, but the retail price of gas itself. For good measure, why they needed to do both, I do not know. They also regulated the wholesale price of gas, how much you could pay a producer to get the stuff out of the ground, also regulated in Washington. For 10, they made it illegal to burn gas in electric power plants or to deploy new gas-fired industrial boilers and furnaces. You just couldn't do it. Now it gets you a Nobel Prize if you burn gas in an electric power plant. Back then, it was a crime. These policies left vast amounts of gas stranded underground, and countless buyers simply unable to buy it at any price at all. Those were the policies that Breyer and others largely dismantled. And they established a framework as they dismantled them that was then used to deregulate the electricity markets and then the telecommunications market. And for good measure, Breyer himself went and worked with Ted Kennedy and deregulated the airlines. The energy market responded bit by bit to this. Homes, businesses, and factories switched to gas and electrified one furnace or boiler or other application at a time as the old hardware wore out and as it became clear that the switch was economically attractive. Detroit could easily have made the very modest modifications in diesel and gasoline engines to get them to run on gas, natural gas, rather than on gasoline or diesel. These are truly modest, tiny modifications. Internal combustion engines run beautifully on gas. They run better, actually, than they do on liquid fuels. But with cars, we had a lock-in problem. I mean, nobody was going to buy wheels that ran on gas until gas was ubiquitously available on the highway, and nobody was going to make it ubiquitously available on the highway until there were wheels to buy it. So while much of the rest of our energy economy weaned itself from oil, or at least cut oil down to size, had substitutes side by side, we drivers locked ourselves into another couple of $1 trillion of wheels that run only on one fuel, on oil. What now? Ignore the speeches and focus your lying eyes on the thousands of pages of fine print, and you find that Washington's energy policy, if it can be dignified with that word, is this. Tighten fuel economy mandates for cars, promote liquid biofuels, especially in Iowa, and impose aggressive carbon mandates to squeeze the carbon out of electricity. But consider where that policy will lead if by chance, and I of course speak entirely hypothetically here, if by chance, it's still money that makes the world go round. How might the spillover of Washington's policy play out in New Delhi or Beijing, where people just can't afford to be wrong about the Brooklyn Bridge or its energy equivalents. And for that matter, how will that policy play out over a decade or two? Political winds change. How will such a policy play out over a decade or two in West Virginia or Ohio, where quite a few Americans also feel too poor to buy economic bridges to nowhere? The poor, the world's 5 billion really poor, consume about half of the world's oil. They hate it even more than we do. They also emit more than half of the greenhouse gas. China, of course, is the largest emitter now on the planet, not the United States. Their emissions are growing much faster than ours, and they refuse to cap them. They desperately need cheap energy, and they won't bet their future on carbon-free economic daydreams. So, fuel economy mandates, efficiency. What do they think? They love efficiency. India's new microcar, the Tata Nano, gets 50 miles per gallon today. Makes our fuel economy standards look remarkably timid. And this is the kind of car that will make gasoline miles affordable to the people on the planet who currently ride motorbikes. Look for 2 billion new cars or so, all very efficient, of course, on the planet's highways. Don't look for much carbon abatement or dropping in the price of oil there. Biofuels. The poor know a thing or two about living on the carbohydrate energy economy. They won't turn edible calories into fuel. They will leave that to the only 2 countries in the world that actually do that at all seriously. One is Brazil, the other is the United States. But if we develop cheap enzymes that can liquefy cellulose, the poor will be delighted to turn wood and grass into miles. A lot of wood and grass. Humanity currently consumes about 8 times as much fossilized carbon as fresh. Virgin grasslands and rainforest will certainly be the cheapest source of cellulose for the 2 billion nanos. On the global greenhouse ledgers, agriculture, forestry, and deforestation already cost the planet more than twice as much as our entire transportation sector costs us in greenhouse gas emissions. Calling something renewable does not guarantee it will be renewed. The biofuels plan may be good politics in corn country in the United States, but it is environmentally preposterous. Electric cars, they're coming for sure, with or without mandates from Washington. Personally, I love them. When battery prices drop enough, which they will, electric miles will end up cheaper than gasoline miles too. Generating enough electricity to fuel all the cars on the planet is actually rather easy, perhaps too easy. China has been building a whole United States worth of new coal-fired power plants every 3 years. Now consider instead what a money-centered strategy might actually deliver here. And we have some experience with this because we've done it before. By that I mean build out infrastructure to make natural gas and electricity ubiquitously available, and unleash competition to extract gas and generate electricity at the lowest possible cost. 2-point energy policy that might actually be worth the name. Gas first. Switching wheels from oil derivatives to natural gas makes our miles about 20% cheaper in both money and carbon terms. The fuel costs less, it emits less carbon. The engines are available today. They, in fact, currently power about 10 million vehicles, about half of them in South America, India, and the rest of Asia, which tells you something about the economics. In my view, Eisenhower's National Highway Program was a great investment. The mistake was to lock it into this vast new infrastructure of demand, to lock that into one fuel, oil, the only fuel, by the way, which could use the highways themselves as its infrastructure for transporting itself to the cars and the trucks that were going to burn it. And while we did that, our pipe police were at their very best throttling the supplies of gas, and both the supply and demand of gas everywhere. Get gas to the highway today, and I don't think there's the slightest economic doubt that many trucks and buses, and quite a few cars too, will be tanking up on it within 10 years. The supplies are domestic, the prices are consistently lower, the technology is there. And if you make that switch, round numbers, and I can defend them if you want to push me, basically using gas to kick oil out of our wheels will save us $100 billion a year in the United States. Now electricity. Coal is cheap, very cheap. Replacing it with gas, which is where a carbon-centered policy pushes us, would cost us an extra $100 billion a year or so, round numbers. So very roughly, there's a $200 billion a year cost spread between using gas economically to chase oil out of our wheels and using gas greenishly to chase coal out of our power plants. I mean, gas is cheaper than oil, but it is much more expensive than coal. Happily, however, there are several other economic facts that work out well on the carbon side, too. Using small gas-fired plants to generate to meet peak loads, peak demand for electricity is in fact economically efficient. You use smaller plants, more expensive fuel. It works out. The spreadsheets really do work out. That's why we generate about 20% of our electricity today with gas. And obviously this depends on the price points, but at the prevailing prices of gas over the last 10 or 15 years, 20% is about the economic optimum, give or take. Thank you, Steve Breyer. A second economic fact, uranium is easily as cheap as coal, and cheaper if you don't strangle it in red tape. China is on track to fire up 4 or 5 new nuclear power plants a year from here on out. We haven't managed to fire up a new one in 30 years. Thank you, Jane Fonda and other well-intentioned Greens who, thought they were doing good, but were just economically fools. And finally, the third economic fact, huge power plants are so much more efficient in the way they burn fuel that so much more efficient than small car engines, that as we generate our electricity in the United States today with our current mix of a lot of coal plus gas plus uranium, with that mix, if you take that electricity today without greening it out anymore and you pump that straight into your wheels, you actually reduce carbon emissions overall. Power plant to wheels, it is lower carbon today, and you can, of course, get better than that if you, for example, unleash uranium. Don't take my word for it. We have this on the analysis of the Indubitably Green World Wildlife Fund. So without even trying, in the last 30 years, Breyer and company, by getting the economics right, actually delivered a very modest reduction in carbon emissions in our energy economy, carbon intensity of our energy economy. We the same amount of energy for slightly less carbon over those 30 years. We burnt an extra 400 million tons of coal a year, but we replaced a good chunk of oil with gas. And while we didn't build any new nukes, the one company bought up a whole bunch of them and pushed their capacity factors up from 70 to 90% and got them uprated to run hotter and so on and so forth, and significantly increased their output. But for the green war on nuclear power, we would have, on the Breyer policy alone, just letting the economics run, we would have substantially reduced our carbon intensity over the last 30 years. If we could snap our fingers and conjure back into existence the nukes we had in the pipeline in nuclear power's heyday before the 3 Mile Island accident, if we could put them back into existence tomorrow, we could, with that single move, put ourselves in compliance with the Kyoto Treaty. I mean, it would knock out that much coal. All right, let us end where we began. Another one of the Marx brothers, Brother Carl, said that history repeats itself, but he got it backward. The energy farce came first, and it's the repeat that will end in tragedy. We did the farce in the 70s, but happily we had back then enough grown-ups around too, like Steve Breyer, to set some really important things straight, and happily the rest of the world wasn't ready back then to eat our lunch. It is today. So, you want to see a yes, we can energy policy in action. Well, as our president often says, we have a choice to make. We can study what actually worked in America in the last 30 years, and we can do more of the same. Or we can watch China, India, and most of the rest of the world do more of the same, more of exactly what we did for the last 30 years, what we did right, while we repeat the mistakes of the past and try and reinvent everything from scratch. We can force Americans to pay Americans to chase carbon willy-nilly, while most of the rest of the world builds factories and power plants and creates real jobs. Or we can beat oil with proven, cheaper, domestic, conventional alternatives and survive, and who knows, perhaps even prosper in this brutally competitive global economy and curb some carbon too. Thank you.
I'm Howard Husick, Vice President of the Institute. I get to play traffic cop on the Q&A. Ground rules are the same as always. Keep it short, keep it informative for question, and if you want to provide your name and affiliation, that'd be great too. Bruce Wilcox.
Yeah, Bruce Wilcox.
And wait for the microphone.
Okay. Why couldn't the interstate highway system provide rights of way for expanded distribution for gas?
They could. And they should. I mean, I do think, if I am as terribly hostile to government intervention in any market, but I will say this one, any serious student of this, don't take it my word, take Steve's, take Paul Joskow's, take Paul McAvoy's, anybody who reads this lock-in was created in Washington. We had two practical fuels all along. I mean, they're both conventional. We had lots of them. They were growing in tandem, and we should never have locked this in. It was a horrendous bungle, our gas policy, and we should have started reversing it in 1973, and if we had done that then, now breaking lock-ins is expensive, and it actually requires some central management. It doesn't happen that often, but this one was born and bred in Washington, and Washington ought to do something to undo it now.
Sir. Hang on.
Yeah. Gene Epstein from Barron's. Thank you for a brilliant and entertaining presentation. Peter, could you address two facts, so-called facts, that I don't know what to do with that have been, I've seen asserted. The first is that batteries require special metals that are potentially scarce and could become very scarce and very pricey, the bigger demand for batteries. The second has to do with the age-old objection to nuclear power based on the Price-Anderson Act that exempted nuclear power plants from having to buy their own insurance against catastrophe, and that they are therefore protected that way unrealistically. Those are the two facts I'd like you to address, if they're facts at all. Thanks.
There's some element of truth to both. Lithium is expensive, I gather, if I understand it correctly, and perhaps somebody in the audience could correct me. I think China has a lot of lithium, so that's a goodie for them. We'll end up buying it from them. That's the highest capacity stuff. You can use worse stuff. Highest capacity for now, okay? Who knows what technology will do next? With that said, the thing about a battery is they're expensive, but they are also one-time things. They're mostly a manufacturing cost once you put it in there, and the lithium doesn't go away unless you really have horrible accidents or something. So you build up a base of lithium. It ought to be a one-time cost. They shouldn't end up in landfills. They won't at their price. Yes, they're expensive. Batteries are expensive. Much of the expense is a manufacturing cost and how you fold this stuff and put together. Manufacturing costs we can beat. Price-Anderson is one among many aspects of nuclear power. I have always, the only defense I can think of Price-Anderson, but I consider it entirely adequate, is simply this. Price-Anderson is a protection against a legal system that simply doesn't function on the basis of reality or science at all right? After TMI, TMI released, 3 Mile Island released, yes, some radioactivity, okay? Minuscule amounts, I mean, quite demonstrably tiny, at any if I had been sleeping at the perimeter wire of 3 Mile Island alone, I would have been getting less radioactivity exposure than sleeping beside my wife, because your bones contain potassium. We're all mildly radioactive, all right? I mean, these were small numbers, but in our legal system, you can get infinite lawsuits out of small numbers. And so I view Price-Anderson as a completely brute force and unprincipled answer to a legal system that will create lawsuits out of anything, all right? You get the science right, and you wouldn't need that, but the runaway potential for claims is infinite here. And look, you don't have that there. The private money knows where to go, and build nukes in South Africa or China or somewhere else. I think the Greens made a colossal blunder with nuclear power, and they know it too, and I will never forgive them, because I wrote about this in '83. Lots of people did. No self-respecting engineer likes coal. All right, we ought to have been pushing this out of our system decades ago. And I throw up my hands in despair, because we all knew it all along. And the people who blocked it, they know who they are, and they're the people who are now trying to save the planet. And that's what they were saying back then too.
Thank you. DeRoy Murdoch with the Atlas Economic Research Foundation. When I speak with my green friends, many of them like to talk about plug-in cars and what a wonderful world when people come back from work and plug their cars into a socket in the garage, and wouldn't this be wonderful? And then I ask them, well, once they plug it into the wall, does the power come from the wallpaper or from the lights inside the garage? At that point, they usually completely blanch and their jaws drop and they don't know what to say. I'm wondering if, given that we have this NIMBY problem, it's so difficult to open up new power plants, at what point, if we are going to go down the road with electric cars, will they start to tax the system? Maybe not on a cold day, but on a day that's 95 degrees with everybody running air conditioners. At what point do these new electric cars tax the grid and become a problem rather than a solution?
Not as soon as many people think. I mean, two points. First of all, on the basic, question of if you generate the electricity, is it a plus, a minus, or a wash? Economically, it's clearly a plus. I mean, electricity, if you can deliver it straight to electric motors on your wheels, is way cheaper. I mean, way cheaper at current prices than diesel or gasoline pushed through a small engine in your car. It's like factors of 4 or 5 or something like that, if you can get it there. Batteries will then boost your price, but those prices will come down. On carbon, same numbers. Read plugged in, World Wildlife Federation. It's in my book too. They quote me. I'm delighted to say it. First time in history, I think, a sort of true greenie has quoted me. But anyway, they get it right. Some of us were saying this 10 or 15 years ago, and they were excoriating us then. But the carbon numbers are good as well. Taxing the system. We have huge overcapacity in generating plants in this country, certainly on the gas peakers, and that's because we don't have an integrated electric economy. We've got 3 discrete grids, and we don't move power as we should. If we knit together our electric grid, which we should, and which we've written about as well at the Manhattan Institute and endorsed, you get nighttime is very rarely peaking, okay? So a lot of your nighttime capacity is there. These are analyses, again, not mine. The national labs and others have done this. Not only do you actually have a lot of spare capacity at night, you actually push down prices if you use it. You push down prices because all of your transmission capacity is unused, and about 3 cents per kilowatt hour of your electricity is in your transmission and distribution costs. So you spread that over a larger base. You get economies of scale, essentially, in your transmission, and you also get economies of scale in your generating capacity. The main problem is that your really cheap capacity, your nukes and your coal, are running close to 80 or 90%. So you begin maxing those out. If the wind keeps having a negative price, we'll have lots of negative, wind costs less than 0 with the current tax credits in the middle of the night. Nobody wants it, and you're getting a tax credit for every unwanted kilowatt hour you generate. Denmark gives this stuff away. But eventually you will. But there are actually plenty of places, not in New York, of course, but in the South and so on, in Quebec and elsewhere, that actually are very happy to generate power. And you can move this stuff today with high voltage technologies over 1,000 miles with very modest losses for about less than a penny a kilowatt hour. So it's a solvable problem. What Greens ought to worry about is that you put everything you can into the electric car, you get this technology dirt cheap, and then of course New Delhi will like it and so will Beijing. But they may not power it with Boone Pickens's windmills in Texas. They may burn coal, which may well be cheaper. In fact, I expect they will.
My name is Barry Milliken. I'm a naive consumer of propane gas. I take in my little gas grill tank every few weeks, and they won't let me fill it up myself. It goes in high pressure. It's too dangerous. They tell me don't go for more than a half a mile because if I have an accident, it will explode. What do I need to learn to allay my fears about gas cars using natural gas?
Well, I suppose one quick way to learn is blow up a gasoline tank. I mean, that will... Look, the more concentrated the fuel, the bigger the boom you can create, all right? I mean, and gasoline will create one spectacular fire, And it doesn't happen very often because they've learned, engineers, people always, I've had this debate for 20 years on nuclear power plants. I said, you're worried about a nuclear plant? Fine, worry about the submarines, maybe the aircraft carriers, although they have other means to look after themselves. But don't worry about California. We engineers are very good at pouring cement, You want 1 foot, 2 foot, 3 feet. It's not that hard to. It's just not that hard to contain gases. It was in Henry Ford's day. That was a big engineering factor back then. I have propane. I've got some gas pipes. I've got some oil. I got them all. None of them have ever blown up on me. This is not to trivialize it, but. And of course, when you're doing it yourself and you're at Walmart, that's one thing. But you won't be doing it that way. With gas. And to start with, the gas will go overwhelmingly first into the heavy iron, the buses and the trucks and so on. They're very price sensitive. They would make the switch today if the stuff were available on the highway.
Far left there.
Joe Donner. Coal is certainly in this room today the bad guy. What about clean coal? Is that a shibboleth? Is it an oxymoron? Is it just not cost effective? What does clean coal mean, and is it realistic?
Well, there are various models, but the one I've heard is of course, the notion that you would go to the flue gases and you scrub the carbon dioxide out along with the sulfur, which we're already scrubbing, and so on. Is it feasible? I don't doubt it can be done. I do know that today's scrubbers have, for not coal, but for get mercury and sulfur and so on out, have boosted the, approximately your capital cost in your plant, I think, is about 1/3 scrubber now. So it's a fairly serious hit, but coal is so darn cheap, it just shrugged it off. I've read at least one MIT analysis that says, look, you guys want us to take the carbon dioxide, we'll do that too, and coal will still beat all the others, all right? I don't know if that's true. I really try not to argue spreadsheets because you can't win that game. Everybody's got one. I do know that in China and India, and the people who control most of the carbon emissions, they control most of the carbon supply of the world, most of the demand, and most of the economic growth, and most of the population, and they'll put their scrubbing in when it suits them and not one day before. And
yes, right here.
Hi, I'm Clara Del Villar, and I represent the Energy and Environmental Research Center. I would tell you that very much so, clean coal is a technological reality. But Peter, your presentation was superb, and we also agree strongly with your natural gas orientation. My question is, do you see a role for hydrogen? We view coal as a path to a hydrogen economy potentially, but I'm curious, how do you see hydrogen playing out here as a transportation source, fuel source?
First of all, thank you for your kind words. I figure I must be getting oil. I'm old and soft here because I keep finding myself in agreement with what I used to think of as diehard greenies who didn't know nothing. So anyway, I'm delighted. I mean, it's a good thing. I actually think there are some points of convergence here. And with a natural gas center, we ought to do it, and it'd be really great if we could get a lot of the mainstream. Look, let me just pound that table a little bit. It's great to always think about the perfectly green grid, all powered with sun and with wind, right, and the plug-in hybrid, and we're all cruising down the highway on the sun itself. Isn't that nice? But, gas is here and now today. I mean, the technology, Cummins, you can buy a gas engine there. You can bolt it right into your frame of your 40-ton truck today, okay? Your sun and wind are there. Sun and wind grid may not come tomorrow. In fact, it could take a very long time. With that said, hydrogen, I mean, there are two ways to look at hydrogen. I think one is a non-starter, but the other may well be. One is to say, look, we've got these fossil fuels, let's take the hydrogen out and just ditch the carbon. With coal, that means ditching 80% of the thermal stuff in there. With oil, it means ditching 60% or something, and with gas, it means ditching 40% or something. The numbers are something like that. I mean, a lot of the heat we actually get comes from burning the carbon, not burning the hydrogen. So, that has, of course, concomitant impacts on the price of the fuel, basically. I mean, if you take only 20% of the heat value out of your coal, you increase the price by a factor of 5. But however, hydrogen as essentially a storage medium, which you can extract cheap on base load power in the middle of the night, and then put it into cars or so on. Internal combustion engines are very happy burning hydrogen too. They like flammable gases. I mean, they burn flammable gases today. You could virtually screw a hydrogen tank with minor modifications into your car today. So that's a good place to start. Storing hydrogen on board hydrogen is an incredibly slippery stuff. It's much harder to contain than larger molecules. It's very hard to pipe. It degrades pipes. It eats away at seals. So as an the fuel cell people love it because fuel cells you run on straight hydrogen, and so if you can drop a fuel cell under your hood and you have a tank of hydrogen, you can then, lock your lips to the tailpipe and you'll be breathing basically sort of water, right? I mean, that's all that comes out. Once again, these are nice. I'm pro everything that's not oil. I really think we have powerful reasons to beat oil. I mean, I'm much more worried about the geopolitics of oil than I am about carbon, but so maybe we can meet in the middle here.
Yes, in the far back, and then John.
Hi, I'm John Pregoff from Equinox Partners. I was wondering if I could get your take on two initiatives to put natural gas into transportation. One, as I understand it, is that certain areas in California, the Port of Long Beach, are sort of forcing all the trucks that drive in there to be using natural gas in the future. And also in New Delhi, actually, you mentioned before. In New Delhi now, all taxi cabs run on compressed natural gas, and I think a lot of the city buses are starting there's a mandate that I think came from the Supreme Court for buses to also be running on it.
Yeah, the third world did this for a mix of smog reasons and economics, but you can be quite sure that if it were doubling or tripling the cost of their wheels, they wouldn't be doing it. The thing about natural gas is it is truly everywhere. It's as ubiquitous as coal, shales everywhere on the planet. People have as much reason to love natural gas if they can handle it as coal, because it's not confined to 10% of the oil nasties. They've got lots of natural gas on top of their oil, and I sort of hope they don't learn to liquefy it very well so that they can continue blowing it off and flaring it if they like. But anyway, the problem. Look, urban fleets are going natural gas today, okay? You've got, I forget which is it, UPS or FedEx or both of them. If you've got a central place, particularly if it's in the right part of the country, not Florida, but in sort of place somewhere near a big gas pipeline, so you're getting good gas prices, they're a factor of 2 variation nationwide, infrastructure issue. And you have a fleet that has to drive during the day and can tank up at night. It's larger vehicles, so you can get lots of gas on board. It's a very attractive fuel today, bus lines and so on. You want to get all the heavy iron there, and that means you've got to get the interstate traffic there as well. And 150-mile range is no use to you in a 40-ton truck if the next gassing up place is 155 miles down the road, right? I mean, you actually have to put the stuff there and tell Detroit and people who are investing in these wheels it's there for the long term. You can count on it for at least the life of your engine. It will continue to be supplied. I don't think you have to do it the whole highway system at once. I think you could do it on arteries, east-west and north-south. And I do think it has to be there with a real commitment that it will stay, because people won't. But I will tell you, the airlines and the truckers are in the same boat in this respect. They are tremendously fuel sensitive. I mean, that is a huge factor for them, and they can't run on batteries. This is their exit from oil. It's not most of our oil economy, but it's a pretty darn big number, the heavy iron, and you've got to do it more than the Port of Long Beach or the urban centers. You have to get the long-haul stuff as well.
John Stossel.
John Stossel, temporarily unemployed. Peter, sometimes I think you're too smart for our own good, and that so much blows by here. You're referring to your friend Steve Breyer here, which I would wager half this audience didn't know who you meant. You were talking about the current Supreme Court justice appointed by Clinton.
The one and only, yeah.
Why is he the hero here? I think of him as a really tedious appellate judge in New England who...
Steve Breyer, listen, I won't hear anything wrong with him. Steve Breyer, along with two powerful women, made me who I am, whatever that is. I mean, he was a mere professor at Harvard when I was there, and a wonderful professor. Go read his stuff. I mean, people don't know this. As I say, I'm sorry we lost him. There was a bunch of young economists. He has an economics from, or PP&E from Oxford, I think, or Cambridge, I forget which, before he wasted his life becoming a lawyer. This was what is now a FERC problem. This was the people who had taken a mandate to regulate interstate pipes and had turned it into a comprehensive end-to-end regulation of the gas markets. This is a no-brainer nowadays, right? I mean, it's so obvious. Why would you do that, right? Why would you regulate the retail price of gas when you have no monopoly other than on the pipe? You've got to regulate the pipe, fair enough. Why would you regulate the wholesale price and the retail price at the same time? A recipe for sort of economic disaster at both ends of the pipe when neither is a monopoly. No, you shrink the monopoly down. Steve said, it's obvious now, right? It wasn't then. It wasn't in 1970. Paul McAvoy, Steve, Josko, these guys pointed out the obvious. It's a tribute to people who really changed thinking, that you think, gee, why does anybody think that's smart? It was smart then. Believe me, it was heresy. Okay, and that exact model was then put on our electric industry, and they peeled off a lot of the generation and shrank the. That had other problems, by the way, but smaller problems. They shrank the regulated sphere down to the wires, which meant you could get very competitive generation at the edges. Exelon then buys up all these horribly mismanaged nukes, which were running at 70% capacity factor because they kept going down, run by little mom-and-pop shops, in places like New Hampshire and so on, who didn't know the first thing about this. And they pushed up the capacity factors to 90%, and they, got excellent safety on this. And then they went and got them uprated. They went to the NRC and said, we're so good, can't we jack up the knob on the temperature a little bit here, because you can run, and this is limited for, and by boosting the temperature, you squeeze more electricity out of it. And that's what economic policy does when it's done right. It's sort of a NAFTA or an eBay for electricity or something, or for gas. It let the market do its thing. and it expanded output, and it stabilized prices even as the Greens were piling on all sorts of new requirements, and it pushed carbon intensity down a little bit too. It would have done far more if somehow the nukes hadn't been bottled up. Yeah, that's Steve Breyer, right. By the way, if you want to read, this is very faint praise, the tiny bit of intelligent, coherent telecom analysis that's coming out of Washington now is in Steve Breyer's Supreme Court opinions, often in dissent, but anyway.
Right here, sir.
Daniel Gressel, Elias Asset Management. I'm just going to relate a few things in my own personal life about natural gas. I'm building a house, and I'm putting in a cogeneration unit that uses natural gas to generate my own electricity. I'm able to do it for 10 cents a kilowatt hour as opposed to buy it from Connecticut Light and Power for 20 cents a kilowatt hour. And I actually you could put in for $3,400, you could add a gas pump that pumps 1 gallon per hour into your natural gas car, of which there's only one model in the United States that's sold only in New York City and in California. And there, I get to buy gasoline for 75 cents a gallon, equivalent, and I don't have to pay any road taxes because they haven't figured out how to tax me there yet. I haven't done it yet because I didn't want to buy the Honda. So there's lots of opportunities to do it, but obviously we're missing a lot of infrastructure, and it's taken me, oh, I forgot to tell you, I get all the heat then for free. Yeah. The cogeneration facility only uses 25% of the energy to make natural gas, and I get 65% to heat my swimming pool 12 months a year for free.
Yeah, combined heat and power, if you use your gas locally, you get fantastic efficiencies if you take the heat off as well. The problem is that you actually then have to begin piping heat, or you have way too much heat, because to meet the electric loads, you get far more heat than you need for your 12-hour shower or whatever it is. I mean, you just can't use it all. But so no, there are, and you're right about the prices as well. I mean, look, I don't do spreadsheets except when they're in the past. I went to the DOE's numbers, and these are well known. Other people had said it, but I wanted to confirm it. The DOE has tracked the wholesale price of gas, wholesale price of gasoline and diesel for 30 years. They're all in tables. You just take the ratio of the two, so no adjustments for inflation or anything else. And the ratio of this is it's in my paper. It goes from about occasionally they close, you know, when a pipeline goes down from the Gulf or something and there's a real disruption, occasionally the gap closes. It's averaged about somewhere between a factor of 2 and 3, the ratio of gasoline and diesel to gas, at twice to 3 times as expensive over the last 30 years, consistently. Those are just the numbers, and they are going. I'm telling you, they're going like this because the global demand for oil is going up and up and up. Remember those super efficient 50 mile per gallon nanos? I mean, we'll swamp our demand for oil, and we've got this huge amount. I mean, it's a gigantic amount of new gas whistling out of the shale. The thing about gas is, I put this in my paper, I thought it was rather cute when I thought of it. I mean, we regulated all this gas because it's so thin and slippery, you know, that it has to go in pipes. You can't, thin and slippery it's the one fossil fuel that really wants to come out of the ground. It doesn't want to be down there. You know, you give it half a chance and it comes into your coal mine and it just bubbles out, all right? And that's basically what the industry got around to doing when, you know, this deregulation brought things to the point where the oil price is going way up here. Gee, we should begin. So they begin pumping down in, and they basically just crack the rock. You know, they put little hairline cracks in it. Would be useless for oil. Crude, this adulterated, dishonest stuff, I want my money back. But anyway, crude is thick, molasses, okay, and it wouldn't flow through that at all, but gas will happily come whistling out through these cracks, and you know, the poor gas industry, I rejoice, they weep, because, I mean, they're not earning any money now. They got lots of gas, but the prices are just as low. And they're going to go down, and they're going to stay down, and India's got it, and China's got it, and it's our technology that'll get it out. And, you know, if we push this technology, it's not just here, you know, but they will then make that switch too. And if we do it well enough, they'll actually use some of it to knock out coal too, and then we'll be really happy.
Yes, over here.
Robin Kravitz. Years ago, I arbitrated a dispute between 2 oil companies. One wound up buying the other one. But one of the points they made was that they work hand in hand with Detroit, with every automotive manufacturer. The car companies have to design their engines based upon the fuel that's available, and the fuel that's available with all the additives has to be based upon what technology can be used. What would you just prioritize, if you would, the first 4 obstacles by virtue of regulation or whatever that need to fall in order for that lock to disperse and to bring gas and working between the gas companies and the automotive manufacturers, not just American, but international as well?
If you take an existing truck or car and you ask somebody to retrofit it, to take the liquid engine and you're going to spend thousands of dollars, okay? You can't, retrofitting, retooling something after it's come off your factory line is never cheap, okay? You can't change spark plugs cheaply, all right? You can go to Cummins today and buy a gas-fueled truck or bus. They're there. I mean, there are 10 million of these vehicles. Some of them are as small as motorbikes. There are buses and trucks all over the world, half of them in very poor countries, running on this today. The technology is truly trivial. It really is. Because when you run on gas, you can run a higher compression ratio. It doesn't knock as early, which makes it even more efficient. So you'd rather design for a higher compression ratio. Of course, you need a slightly different fuel injection system and some throttles. I mean, Europe sells biofuel things. You can buy one that's both gas and gasoline, but then once again that jacks up the price. I mean, then you're making things much more complicated. The engines are there today. You don't buy one if you're trying to drive from here to San Francisco because you're going to run out of fuel real soon and you won't be able to fuel up. The biggest obstacle, as I see it, is simply having a confidence that there will be gas for the lifetime of your engine where you want it. In all the stationary markets, that's why they were able to switch. They didn't switch until the old hardware ran out, until they knew that the gas was really there to stay and available. The pipes had to be nearby, and if you were going to be a big consumer, you had to have a big pipe so you could get it wholesale rates, not through the trickle of the city. Can I guarantee the switch would happen? No, but you have to have some faith in economics. The price margins have been there for 30 years, okay? And there's no reason to suppose they won't do anything except get wider, okay? You have to break this lock, and my guess is that what it would take is if there is such a thing, who knows, there may not be, but a meaningful guarantee from Washington that if private capital puts the gas along, these 10 or 20 highways to start with, okay, it will stay there, okay, for the lifetime of anybody who buys a truck engine. Let us say, these things wear out reasonably fast, but give it 10 or 15 years. And then it will be incremental. I mean, then you build from there. I mean, that's how the electric grid, that's how infrastructures get built, okay? And we did it for the electric grid. And by the way, we don't need that so much for electric cars because the electricity is already pretty ubiquitous. You do have pretty good lines to all those gas stations and so on already, and you can put more power down.
Last question from the far end there.
Yes, my name is Greg Swinehart. Fabulous presentation. You alluded to shale cracking earlier. I've seen headline articles about the externalities associated with that in terms of pollution, runoff. Can you just comment on the science and engineering around that, please?
Look, the biggest, I think, the reason some diehard Greens will say don't go to gas is gas is methane. It's a powerful greenhouse gas, right? And if you take it out carelessly and it doesn't go, you don't burn it first, okay? And it leaks out of your pipes, as can happen with bad pipes, or leaks out of your car, or just doesn't get burned. You want to burn methane. I mean, once you've got it out, you're way better off burning it than not burning it, okay? It lowers your greenhouse gas load by burning it. So obviously, a larger economy, gas economy, creates that risk, okay? You have a risk with all fuels, with uranium, with oil. We've had large releases of all of these. Those are engineering problems, and they're fixable engineering problems. We know how to handle gas. I mean, it's running into millions and millions of homes right now, okay? We have furnaces that, little pilot light is basically all that stands between you and blowing your house to kingdom come, all right? I mean, but it's coming, it's coming in your stove and so on. This is, I don't want to trivialize this, but, this is not rocket science. I mean, this is basic gas handling. Hydrogen, by the way, is very much more difficult. Hydrogen is very hard to keep in any one place. Methane, not that hard.
Please join me in thanking
I think it is clear how fortunate we are to believe in the power of ideas.
Supply the common sense and the fresh thinking of the Manhattan Institute.